Good afternoon. This is Michelle Giroux of the Rural Wireless Association. The RWA Education Committee is pleased to welcome you to this RWA webinar on the Mobility Fund Phase 2 Challenge Process. I have a few quick items to cover before our presenters get started. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. We encourage you to type your questions into the chat box throughout the presentation, and our presenters will answer questions at the end of the webinar. If you know which presenter you would like to answer your question, please type their name with your question. The chat feature is located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Finally, this conference is being recorded August 22nd, 2017, and will be available on the RWA website. I would now like to turn the conference over to Erin Fitzgerald of RWA.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I want to do a fairly brief background for all of you on Mobility Fund Phase 2, and then we'll let Chip talk a little bit more specifically about, the challenge process and some tools that could be useful as that process moves forward. So I do want to just kind of set you up and give you a bit of background here. So we're looking at a budget of about $453 million for a 10-year term. So that's about $4.5 billion over that 10-year term. So it's a big chunk of money, of course. Certainly there is more that needs to be done than what can be done with that amount of money, but that's what we're looking at. The disbursement mechanism is a nationwide multi-round reverse auction. So for those of you who who are partaking or paying attention to the incentive auction process, the broadcasters had a reverse auction. So it was a descending clock. So the prices are higher at the beginning and they go lower. Or I guess in this case it's not a price, it's the amount of money that you'd receive for an area. The geographic areas eligible for support, basically anywhere that does not have unsubsidized 4G LTE with a minimum advertised download speed of 5 megabits per second. So that's the threshold. And I do want to note that there is no corresponding upload speed. This was a point of contention during the proceeding and something RWA felt very strongly about and expressed those concerns about the need for an upload standard, but that is not included. So the download speed of 5 megabits per second is what you're looking at in terms of determining an area's eligibility for funding. The Commission will make preliminary area eligibility decisions based on a one-time data collection that is forthcoming. Initially, the Commission was interested in using Form 477 data. That was, what they had talked about and sort of thought about for a long time, but a lot of entities had concerns about the reliability of Form 477 data, which are not new to any of you. So in the most recent order that was released in August, they reconsidered this decision to use Form 477 data and are using this one-time data collection, which we'll talk about in just a second. They're using a square mileage coverage metric rather than POPs or road miles. This is something that RWA really pushed for and we're happy to see adopted. Obviously, Mobility Fund Phase 1 was a road mile metric, which had some issues, and then POPs, of course, can be problematic as well. So that's what we're looking at here. And then we're not sure yet what the minimum geographic bidding area will be. We know it'll be census block groups or census tracts. And that's something that the Commission, it's a decision they've sort of, kicked down the road a bit. It's something that they will consider during the pre-auction public notice process. I want to give an estimated timeline here. I will preface this, with the statement of what we're hearing from the Commission is very different than what we think will actually play out. The Commission has said that they want to conclude the challenge process by January 31st, 2018, and they want to do the auction shortly thereafter, meaning they want to do the auction in 2018. We generally think that this is very optimistic, and we've heard the same from other carriers as well. basically, the challenge process order wasn't adopted until this month. There will be another public notice and comment cycle related to the challenge process still forthcoming, as well as other issues that need to be resolved. So, that's one of the considerations. Further, the Commission is also in the process of putting together the CAF Phase 2 auction. We know that this will take up time and resources, and given the stage at where things are, CAF Phase 2 is pretty far ahead of Mobility Fund Phase 2 in terms of being able to stand up an auction. So we think that, that will happen first. We don't think it's likely that they will run two auctions at the same time. And so, while a CAF 2 auction in 2018 is likely, we think a Mobility Fund Phase auction in 2018 is not likely. Instead, we think early to mid-2019 is more realistic. But obviously, we will keep members up to date as far as timing goes as we hear more. So I want to talk just a bit about the data collection, and frankly, we're still getting, we'll still get more information as to how this is going to work. But again, the FCC is going to require a new one-time data collection for 4G LTE coverage. Carriers are going to need to submit a propagation map indicating where they have 4G LTE coverage, and again, that coverage is defined by download speeds of 5 megabits per second at the cell edge with an 80% probability and a 30% cell loading factor. That 80% probability is a compromise. The initial proposal put forth by CTIA was for 90% probability. The Commission's initial draft said 70%. So they kind of met in the middle on that, and 80 is better than 70, but not quite as good as 90 as far as we're concerned. Not carrier is going to need to submit data for this. If you don't provide qualified 4G LTE service, you don't need to submit coverage data. So it's just those carriers that provide 4G LTE that need to submit coverage data. Filers need to report an outdoor level of coverage. That's what you're looking at. Coverage boundaries need a resolution of 100 meters or better. This is all very engineering for the lawyers amongst us, but filers have to use optimized RF propagation models and parameters that are used in your normal course of business. So for the engineers in the room, that's important. You need to report signal strength in terms of RSRP and clutter factor categories used to generate coverage maps. If the signal strength in the coverage maps varies, you need to report those variations. And then you can see loss value needs to be reported as well. In addition to the propagation maps and all of that detail, providers also have to submit 3 readily available handsets that challengers can use to conduct speed tests in the challenge process. And then also, you need a qualified engineer to certify, as to accuracy as of the maps generation date. So, that's in addition to the maps that you're submitting. Basically, we're waiting on a public notice to come out on this. We're expecting a public notice that provides additional instructions, so like some more data specifications, file formats, and any other technical parameters that the FCC deems necessary. So we're keeping an eye out for this. I will note that I had a conversation with US Cellular today, and they had some concerns about some of the file formats the Commission is thinking about using. We're in the process of getting more information about that, but we're kind of waiting with bated breath on those instructions. We do know that the deadline for data collection submission will be at least 90 days after that public notice comes out. So you'll have 3 months to get that in. And then just something to consider here. So when the data is collected, it's going to determine which areas are funding eligible. As a later data collection date is going to reflect more build out, which logically will reflect more unsubsidized coverage. So an earlier data collection is not necessarily a bad thing in terms of having more area eligible for support. So the challenge process, we're going to talk a little bit about, and again, the challenge process is, we're going to need another proceeding, another comment cycle to fill in some gaps here, but we'll talk about what we know. As I mentioned, the FCC is going to make eligibility decisions based on data collection. So that data collection we just talked about is going to dictate this initial eligibility map. After that map is released, challengers are going to have 150 days to initiate a challenge of one or more of those areas. Now, 150 days is more, I think, than anyone expected. The initial proposal and sort of, item put out 60 days, which was just far, far, far too few. And so in our conversations with the commission, we said we need at least 120 days. More days would be useful. And the commission agreed. And in part, we're not sure when this process is going to happen. Presumably for folks in mountainous areas and areas with inclement weather, any of this that happens during winter could really slow things down. So 150 days was a good compromise from the commission. We know that government entities and Form 477 filers are able to be challengers. Consumers and other entities, if they wish to take part in the challenge process, they can file a waiver in order to allow them to do so. In some cases, this may not be necessary, but for some of you, this could be very useful as far as if you need grassroots, sort of on-the-ground support for your challenge. This could allow that, though they have to jump through a few more hoops to get a waiver. And again, the challenge area size is a minimum size of at least 1 square kilometer. So you can't come in and challenge, say, 100 yards, somewhere. It's got to be at least 1 square kilometer. And then to certify a challenge, challengers have to submit actual speed test data using some standardized parameters. And we'll talk about a few of those parameters later, but, the hope here was that the challenge process could be started with, the certification as to a good faith belief that service in, unsubsidized service in an area did not meet the minimum minimum service standards, and that did not fly for the commission. They're requiring the submission of actual speed test data. Challengers can use data from hardware or software-based drive tests or application-based tests. And Chip, I think, is going to provide a bit more information in terms of some specifics there, but you can use drive tests or app tests. Challengers are going to submit challenges via USAC's portal. And I will note that this portal is not yet, not finished. It is not yet started. So we see this as a pretty significant hurdle to getting this challenge process off the ground in terms of, what, things that need to be accomplished before the challenge process can really begin. We'll, again, keep folks updated on what that looks like, but we do know that the portal is going to be an issue. Once the challenger submits its evidence into the portal, the system is going to do an automatic validation. So the validation of the information that you submit is reviewed automatically. It's not going to be looked at by a person. It's going to be done, through the system. And basically, as long as you submit that data ahead of the deadline, if that data is insufficient, that it'll be kicked back to you and you can edit it. But once that deadline happens, you can't edit it anymore and your challenge will be thrown out. So it really behooves, I think, carriers to file the information as early as they can to get that feedback in terms of, if you need to make changes, you can do that ahead of the deadline. Challenge parties have 30 days to submit additional data via the portal. They're not required to do so. If they don't, oppose the challenge, they don't need to support anything in that way. And then after the challenge window closes, commission staff will adjudicate these challenges, and the burden of proof, so to speak, is on the challenger. So note that. This goes back to timelines very quickly here. Legacy support phase out. Obviously, for those of you receiving legacy support now, you know that you're frozen at that 60% level. On the first day of the month following the release of the Mobility Fund Phase 2 auction closing public notice, legacy support will change in the following ways. It will either be converted to Mobility Fund Phase 2 support, which will go, of course, to the winning bidder in an eligible area. Support may be maintained in an eligible area that does not have a winning bidder. So again, because this auction is nationwide, there's no guarantee that all eligible areas will have a winning bidder. So in those areas, one CETC will receive sort of preservation of service support. And then in all other areas, so for CETCs serving ineligible areas or for CETCs that lose in the auction, that support will be subject to phase down. So again, after for the first 12 months, it'll be 2/3 of your current support. Next 12 months, 1/3 of your current support, and then all legacy support will end thereafter. And I do want to caution you, and I think this happens for CAF as well when they're talking about phase down. The Commission is quick to say, oh, it's a 3-year phase down. Well, except for the 3rd year, you don't get any support. So it's really a 2-year phase down. So as you're making plans, just note that. And again, when all of this happens really depends on when the auction happens. We're keeping an eye on timing, but we've been telling members really that we expect they will receive some support until 2021 is our best guess. And again, we'll keep you updated there. Desegregation is a big deal and not one that the Commission has dealt with much, which has been pretty frustrating for us. We've submitted several ex partes regarding the need for discussion on this issue. Desegregation will determine how much support is associated with an area, which really impacts reserve prices. It affects preservation of service and things like that. So it's important, but it's not something I can provide you with a lot of information on. Service obligations, I'm going to wrap this up here. Service obligations, MS2 support recipients must offer voice service. For those of you who've been on, we've had several calls about VoLTE and the transition to VoLTE and what this means for voice service. And so this has been an interesting question and one we've posed to the Commission. They don't dictate how you have to provide that voice service, whether it's through VoLTE or through the 2G and 3G networks that currently exist. But as those nationwide 2G and 3G networks are turned down in the coming years, and VoLTE becomes really the only game in town, providing voice support and voice service in rural areas is going to become more difficult. And so that's an issue that we've been talking to the Commission about and trying to figure out how that transition is going to go. Minimum data speed, latency, and allowance requirements must be met for at least one plan in supported areas. You can see the minimum data speed is 10.1, and then a data latency of 100 milliseconds or less round trip, and then the service plan has to offer 2 gigabits per month. Also, one of these plans must be offered at a rate that is considered reasonable, and this is not information that we have yet. This idea of a, quote, reasonable rate will be determined in the pre-auction process. And then obviously, those of you who did Mobility Fund Phase 1, you're familiar with roaming and co-location requirements for supported areas as well that you have to oblige by. And then construction benchmarks, you can see, I'm not going to run through them. Just note that, they talk here after the starting point. The starting point for the interim benchmarks is 6 months from the first day of the month that follows the month in which the Mobility Fund auction closes. So again, that starting point will vary depending on when the auction ends, and the starting point is determinative of what the other interim benchmark dates are. But you can see those listed for you. And compliance reporting data requirements. I know for those of you who did Mobility Fund Phase 1, this is a really big issue and one that is, I think, still frustrating for some of you. And so we don't have a lot of information on what this looks like yet. We have urged the Commission to really state those compliance reporting requirements out front preferably ahead of the auction so that folks really know what they're getting into. This is a huge problem with Mobility Fund Phase 1. We know that they will mirror requirements for the challenge process. So that is helpful in that we'll have that information earlier on. But for right now, I don't have a lot of information to share with you there. All right, and eligibility requirements. I want to note that applicants need to have access to spectrum that is capable of providing the appropriate level of service. That can be spectrum that your company holds. It can be a lease. But you have to have access to spectrum, and you have to demonstrate that in your application. Eligibility is not limited by Mobility Fund Phase 1 participation or by an applicant's size. So I will note, given the level of participation, particularly from T-Mobile in this proceeding, I would not be at all surprised to see them bidding on areas here. I mean, certainly Verizon and AT&T could bid as well, but we've seen a lot of participation from T-Mobile in this proceeding. ETC designation, you do not have to be an ETC to participate. The FCC is allowing winning bidders to seek ETC designation after the close of the auction. Just note that you won't receive any funds until you have that designation in hand. There is no small business bidding credit for Mobility Fund Phase 2, although that is an issue that is subject to a reconsideration petition. I don't anticipate the Commission changing its mind there. You have a couple of commissioners now in the majority who were pretty concerned about the limitations and sort of all the extra stuff put in the incentive auction, and they feel like it really depressed revenues. And so I doubt that they would be interested in putting in similar things here. And then the letter of credit requirement, again, this is something subject to a petition for reconsideration. In fact, some folks have said that they want them to get rid of the letter of credit requirement altogether. I don't see that happening, but hopefully the requirements this time end up being more easily complied with than they have been in the past. I know that for many of you, that was a big undertaking and a pretty significant expense. So I'm going to turn this over to Chip very quickly, but I do, just before I do that, want to note that we will certainly be discussing these issues more at Mobile World Congress Americas in San Francisco on September 12th through the 14th. So if you have not yet made plans to make that trip, please do join us in the RWA Networking Lounge. And if you have any questions on that, we've sent out information to the membership. But if you have any questions about that, please do feel free to contact me or Carrie or any of your RWA folks. The website below or at legal@ruralwireless.org. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chip.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking a few minutes with us this afternoon. I'd like to thank the RWA for allowing us an opportunity to talk with you and hopefully answer some really interesting questions. It's nice to see some already flowing in. So just to give you a quick idea of what we'll be going over, I'm going to briefly talk about, for those of you who are not familiar with Mosaic, sort of what our company is all about. Talk about different application-based data collection options that exist in the marketplace. What we believe is a nice solution for this particular proceeding, and then obviously have an opportunity to answer your questions at the end. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Mosaic, we are a 29-year-old company based in Memphis, Tennessee, and we've been supporting the wireless industry throughout our existence with an array of different software and data products. For those of you who have been around for quite a while, you'll recall we were involved in the original roaming guide before automatic roaming was deployed. And over the years, we've developed an array of different coverage and mapping and spectrum data sets and software that we currently use. We're happy to call 22 of the top 25 carriers in North America as clients, as well as some of the smallest carriers in the marketplace as well. We've been an unbiased and independent source for this information for a long time, and we look forward to continuing to be that. So just to give you a sense for the different types of products, and again, I'm just going to briefly go over this. We have network performance services, we have intelligence products, and we have data visualization. And generally speaking, our performance products are around assessing the quality of the network with different types of application-based sensors that can measure how the network is performing and provide that information back to our clientele. Our intelligence products are basically data sets. We have coverage products. We have rich spectrum products where we keep up with spectrum depth throughout North America and the world. We have the Sensorly crowdsourced data sets that come from our Sensorly applications on iOS and Android. And then we have Map Elements and Tower Source, which are data visualization services around network coverage and spectrum in the Map Elements product, as well as towers and other types of infrastructure assets with Tower Source. And finally, a lot of you know us by putting together interactive coverage maps for our clients, and that's what our Cell Maps product does. So for the sake of this conversation, we're going to really focus on application-based data collection. As we talk about Mobility Fund Phase 2, one of the vital interests of RWA and its members, and I think it can be fairly stated that this was a relative consensus across the industry, was that the challenge process should not put an undue burden on carriers and other entities that were interested in challenging the FCC's eligibility determinations. So with that in mind, we have different approaches to collecting information and solving problems on behalf of our clients. And one of them is what we call Network QoE. Now, this is a private platform that we license out to our clients that allows carriers and MVNOs to use some data collection, SDKs, and software to collect information about their own network. It can be very informative from the standpoint of understanding what the true customer experience is, and you can augment this data along with all of the KPIs coming off of your network analytics software that you may have deployed throughout your enterprise. The data that's collected in this case is completely private, as are, of course, the configurations that ultimately get deployed. It can be used for consumers, but it can also be used for employees to leverage your employees' devices that in many cases you're paying for to help you assess the quality of your network across all of the different networks that you've deployed. Sensorly, as I mentioned before, is a crowdsourced application. So this is basically consumer apps that you could download, and I would urge you to, that will effectively allow you to test and measure the network that you're operating on, and then that data gets aggregated up and then provided back to the consumers as part of the value proposition there. And then, of course, we collect that information and then license that out to interested parties. Now, I think it's important to note that unlike others in the crowdsourced data space, Mosaic is not interested in picking winners and losers. We're not interested in saying whose network we believe is the best in a public way. That's not our business model, and I don't care to have my logo displayed on billboards and television advertisements ever. There are other people that do that, and that's fine, but that's not what our approach with Sensorly is. And finally, Signal Insights, which is what we're going to spend some time talking about today. This is a software that sort of sits in between your traditional crowdsourcing options and background data collection capabilities that you can deploy, and that allows a bit more canned approach to solving this particular problem with or opportunity with the challenge process. So I've already kind of covered this, but basically you've got private data collection with Network QoE. You have Sensorly that collects data and aggregates it up at a large crowdsource perspective, and then you have Signal Insights that's more of an enterprise or carrier network tool. So why challenge? Well, it's obviously, there are $453 million per year for 10 years of opportunity that exists so that carriers can take advantage of some economic support provided from this particular project. If you challenge the results that the FCC comes out with, you're obviously influencing not just the Mobility Fund Phase 2 project, but also future decisions that the FCC may make around how they consider the definitions of served versus unserved areas. What types of considerations should they have from a carrier perspective that they may have missed so far? Or perhaps with advocacy that you and RWA and others may be providing for you, they're just not quite listening to. And we believe that empirical information is a very powerful weapon to try to influence the policymakers. While supporting or while providing and collecting information for your challenge or potential challenge, you can benchmark your competitors' networks while you're doing that, and also perhaps assess the quality of your network in these areas that you're looking to assess whether they're really already served. And finally, you can improve the quality of the data that the FCC has. And I think that with all of the interest across not only the regulatory apparatus at the federal level, but also with Congress, there is an unsatisfied need right now for better information. And the FCC is under quite a lot of pressure from Congress to try to make sure that they improve that. And all of us can help them do that by participating in programs like this. So what are we really talking about with respect to challenging the eligible area determinations from the FCC? Well, as I said before, our approach was to try to really focus on making it easy for carriers to participate in. What I'm going to be talking about here at the end is really about nothing to do with traditional drive testing using traditional drive test software and hardware. That approach is perfectly legitimate and is supported by the FCC's releases so far, but that's an approach that we believe can collect a whole lot more information. Our application-based data collection capabilities are not at the same level. I'm just going to be candid with you there, but it's also much more efficient both at an economic level as well as an operational level, and we'll talk about that. So again, we wanted to provide something that was simple, efficient, and cost-effective. It is an application and a platform that is very easily distributable. So if you're interested, you download the application from Google Play, you sync it with the cloud-based platform that we have, and within minutes you're performing tests, and more importantly, you're seeing results, because all of the data that gets collected is delivered back into the dashboard in near real time. And so you're not going to have to wait days or weeks for the data to post-process before you understand whether or not you have a case to make in a challenge. And then once the data is in our platform, you can download it right then. You can obviously view it in the dashboard and download it immediately for your internal analysis to determine whether you got an opportunity to challenge. So you download the application, you perform surveys in the areas of interest. You're able to immediately visualize the network performance and signal strength data within our dashboard. You can compare the results with the FCC served area determination, and of course you can download that data for your filings. Now, as Aaron indicated earlier, we don't quite know exactly what the processes are going to be associated with the USAC portal that has to get deployed, but with this particular option, it's going to collect a lot more information than what ultimately is required by the FCC, and you may or may not be able to leverage the additional data as part of your challenge, but I believe that certain things are certainly germane to whether or not an area should be considered served. But as of right now, the Commission has strictly determined that it's basically 5 megabits per second downlink is the only consideration. So we don't have any, we don't require any hardware or complicated software for you. As Aaron indicated, it appears that the FCC is going to require each carrier who participates to provide a list of devices that can be easily procured in the field. You download our application onto the device, and you start testing immediately. So let's talk for a sec about the network metrics that are collected. So when you perform a survey, it's going to evaluate the network that the device is running on throughout that survey and provide the type of network, other information about any network parameters associated with the survey network, the signal quality data, which can the type of signal quality outputs obviously vary based on what air interface is used, the data connection metrics, and of course all of your timestamps and the number of samples taken. You can also write notes in the application as well if there's something germane about the area that you're performing the test in. One of the kind of very efficient features about this product as well is with our benchmarking capability. So you can have, so let's say in the area that you're exploring, there are multiple networks that you want to challenge. So you have a primary device that you're interacting with, but the secondary devices can all be synced back to the primary, so you're not having to worry about fiddling around with 2 or 3 devices to perform the test. And so for each device, they all perform the exact same surveys that the primary device does, even though they're obviously on different networks. And this is true, of course, if you were doing Wi-Fi as well, which isn't necessarily germane to this conversation, but it's certainly one of the many use cases for this service. So what does it look like when you're ultimately when you perform these tests? So what you're looking at here is a screen of multiple networks that are tested at the same time. These are 5 different networks. And so in this case, you have the survey is predetermined to run a throughput test every 10 minutes along this route. So in this case, we have 5 devices ultimately controlled by one of them. And the throughput test and all of the associated signal data that I'll show you in a second is being collected throughout that route. So once every 10 minutes, you can see what that looks like. You can look at it with all devices, or you can look at each independent network one at a time right here within the dashboard. And again, it performs an uplink, a downlink, throughput test, both, but the uplink is not considered as part of this challenge. This is additional data network performance information. So as far as your latency, packet loss, and jitter, these are items that thus far the Commission has indicated that they're not interested in as part of the challenge process, but they are collected nonetheless. This is just an overview of sort of of many of the different KPIs that are collected for each one of these. And as you click along the bar up here at the top right beneath the header, all of those metrics would change over time, right? So right now it's showing the initial view, and then you can change it throughout this if you wanted to drill into each individual measurement. This is the signal chart. So in this case, you've got signal measurements for all 5 of the devices. Again, this is another example that the Commission is not interested at this point in time in including as part of the challenge process. I personally believe it's germane to the definition of a served area, but they've elected not to consider anything about signal quality. But again, the data is in there for you. And then this is a map rendering of the routes that we have been looking at. In this case, the devices were running around, and you can see the associated signal quality levels throughout the route. We have uploaded, again, also tower locations just as a reference point here. And there are several different views that are geospatial or map views that are available in the dashboard as well. As I said before, the data that's in the dashboard is also immediately available for you to download. And you can download them a couple different ways. You can create a PDF report that just zips everything that you've seen in the dashboard and wraps it up in a PDF document and allows you to download it and email it immediately. Or, of course, which would be another use case for the challenge process, you can download all of the tabular data that's downloadable in CSV or KML file formats that then you can use as part of the case to be made about the challenge. So just to summarize everything, again, we wanted to focus on making this a really easy service for the industry to use for this specific use case. There are more complex approaches, including traditional drive testing. There are more complex approaches that we at Mosaic have to offer the market, but we feel very strongly that this is the appropriate approach to make it as easy and cost-effective as possible. There's no expensive hardware or software that's required other than sourcing the devices and obviously sourcing the service plans that are associated with each network you want to challenge. It's an Android mobile application that's very easily distributable. So one of the really cool things about this, knowing how many of you have large networks that cover massive amounts of territory, you can have someone who's managing the program at a central location, but have someone who's in the field download the application, sync it to the dashboard that's being controlled centrally, and then your field personnel can perform the tests, but all of the data comes back to the central location without having to deal with emailing anything or allowing the information out into parts of the organization that perhaps you prefer them not to have access to. The throughput test interval can be preset at the beginning of each survey, right? So it's really nice to be able to say, okay, I just want this to run a survey once every 2 minutes and be able to start the survey, put the phone down, and not mess with it again until you're ready to end the survey. And one survey can be as long as 60 minutes, okay? Data is available in real time. We were happy to talk about helping you source devices. This is not typically an area that we like to focus on in getting into the device space, but if that's something that any of you are interested in, we're happy to try to help you as best we can. And this can also be used for CAF2 as you're certifying the networks that have been built out. For those of you who participate in the fixed broadband side of things, you can utilize Signal Insights to perform tests via Wi-Fi because they're, it'll show the network that is on and, of course, the location where the test was performed. So it can be a solution for that approach as well. And I know we're getting some nice questions coming in here. Aaron, I know you wanted to talk a little bit more about the challenge process based on what we know right now. So I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Chip. And we are getting some really good questions. So I'm going to kind of jump through this fairly quickly, but I thought this might be a good place both to generate questions from members, and then also we welcome information in terms of, what is useful from a technical standpoint? What do you need to know for how this challenge process works? Obviously, there will be a public notice. We're going to have time to talk about this. We're going to have time to dialogue with members. But as things occur to you, maybe not today, but in the future, what are the things you're looking for that are going to help you determine, if and how you're going to participate in the challenge process? So I want to go through kind of what we know and some of what we don't know. We know all speed tests have to be conducted between 6 a.m. and 12 a.m. The Commission says, these are times when consumers are most likely to use mobile broadband data. Okay. Also, speed tests have to substantially cover the entire challenge area, and so for the purposes of this, the commission says that substantially covered is 75% of the challenged area. We know that challengers have to take these speed measurements no more than a fixed distance apart from one another within the area. We don't know what that fixed distance is. That is something that the commission is going to determine in the a forthcoming public notice. So that's kind of one of the blank spots here. And then we know that the FCC was only going to accept data collected after the publication of the initial eligibility map and within 6 months of the scheduled close of the challenge window because, they want the data to be fresh. They don't want to use old data. And again, we just don't know when the challenge process is going to happen. So, things that will dictate that, the data collection, as we talked about, the creation of the USAC portal, and then also this forthcoming notice and comment proceeding. So this is some of what we know, some of what we don't. I anticipate that the public notice will be pretty technical in nature in terms of, file submissions and things like that. But as this process moves forward, please continue to be in touch with us and let us know, what is, what's important to you and what's not. Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you for questions now.
Wonderful. Thanks, Erin. Okay. We have a question asking if latency, will latency need to be less than 100 milliseconds?
So I want to distinguish this, and hold on, I'm running through my pages here, so please forgive the noise. So latency is not an issue in the area eligibility piece. So in terms of, what service, what qualified 4G LTE service is in determining what areas are eligible, latency is not an issue. They're only looking at 5 megabits per second download. There is a data latency requirement in terms of the service obligations. So yes, the requirement there is at least 90% of the required measurements must have a data latency of 100 milliseconds or less round trip. So yes, there is latency requirement for build out, but not for area eligibility determination.
Okay, next question. Does this require CPE for fixed wireless networks?
So no, Mobility Fund is focused just on mobile broadband, not on fixed broadband. So for the data submission, carriers will have to submit 3 mobile handsets, readily available that can be used to test the networks. It does not include CPE equipment for fixed wireless.
Okay. And would you like to do this follow-on question, Erin, the next one?
Oh, sure. What is the follow-on question? Let's see.
I'll ask the next one. How much data is, how much data is collected in the testing, and must the other carrier network pay for plans?
So I think this is specific to CHIP's sort of section. I think CHIP, they're interested in how much data your program collects, and sort of what are the, what are the costs involved in the amount of data used.
Yeah, so to answer the first question, the throughput tests using Signal Insights, the amount of data that's consumed on a data plan will vary based on the speed of the network. It can vary anywhere between 35 and 75 megabytes of a data plan for each throughput test. Now, there's no data expense, if you will, associated with the metrics that are collected in the background. But for every throughput test, yes, an average 50 to 60 megabytes would be reasonable. And with respect to the second question about the who must pay for the plan, so the FCC has indicated that each carrier that's submitting the update or the new coverage map will provide a list of 3 devices, and then the challenger would then have to procure the device and procure the appropriate data plan associated. So that would just depend on which networks you're looking to challenge, where, and then being able to source the devices and an appropriate consumer plan.
Yep. And so, as you guys are sort of thinking this through, one of the expenses that is perhaps not, first of mind, but will be a thing is, how much data, how much is data going to cost you?
And just to follow up with a couple of questions. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the next couple of questions were for me, so I was just going to jump on in. So the question about iOS, Signal Insights is an Android-only service. That's for a couple of different reasons. The primary one is the Android ecosystem allows a lot more information to be collected than does iOS. Going into this proceeding, it was unclear whether or not the Commission was going to require signal data, for example, and that's one of the areas that iOS, its operating system, is highly restrictive of how an application can collect information about signal quality. And there are an array of other limitations that exist within iOS that I won't really bore you with, but I'm happy to talk about some of those offline. We have iOS-supported data collection capabilities. I want to be clear about that, but Signal Insights is specific to Android. Can Signal Insights connect to a local server? Absolutely. We can remotely deploy a server that our clients can deploy on their own network if they want, or we can certainly support it via regional cloud-based server support. So happy to talk about whatever use cases would demand out. But we do this all the time. We spin up servers to make sure that the tests are more local. Can you clarify the every 10-minute sample? So when you start a survey in the app itself, you can preset the cadence of the throughput tests that are performed. And this is for a couple of reasons, one of which for the safety of the user so that they don't have to be fiddling around with the device throughout the surveys. But it's also so you can proactively limit the amount of throughput tests that get performed to protect yourselves from data network utilization and associated costs. And you can go down to, I believe, as low as once a minute, and up from there, and set that setting on the front side. And again, every one of the Bluetooth sync devices will run the exact same cadence. I've talked about iOS already. Okay, so the Signal Insights requires a cloud account, but I don't see where to create one. Yeah, so you can download the Signal Insights application from the Google Play Store, but the cloud account is something that we configure for you on our side. So you just need to reach out to us, and we can talk through that process. Okay, so here's a question about when you purchase handsets and plans from carriers to do your testing, will the plans be truly unlimited data plans? It seems they can do things to their network to govern the experience that may impact testing. So certainly there is a risk to any use of a network by a consumer, and this is what we're effectively replicating, that the device could be throttled based on certain either data usage or policies that the serving carrier has in place. In this case, of course, that's possible in this particular use case. But of course, if that were the case, then the network could slow down the performance of the network for that user, and thus make it a worse customer experience, or in this case, a worse network testing experience. So it's not in the serving carrier's interest to do that, but that's certainly possible.
So another question. Oh, sorry, Chip.
No, go ahead.
So another question is, does the FCC define what the A and Z locations are when testing latency? This is something I need to look at a little bit more closely. The words that I see are round trip, but in terms of kind of where that A to Z location is, I'm not sure, but that's certainly something that we will investigate more closely, and we'll put in, our next briefing on any of this stuff. I had another question in regards to timing of the data collection, and this is actually a really timely question because I just got an update on this today. The Commission is seeking expedited PRA approval for the data collection. The Office of Management and Budget needs to approve various data collections that the agencies want to impose. And so the Commission is asking the Office of Management and Budget to sort of rush this through. Based on the letter that they sent, it looks like they're trying to get the ability to sort of open the data collection in September. I'm not sure that that's possible, but of course you have 90 days. So, even if the public notice with the specifications was released, say, tomorrow, and, the PRA expedited approval went through, you're looking at a deadline of, towards the end of November. So, that's kind of where we're at. The Commission is certainly pushing this forward, but, we'll keep you up to date as to what that data collection looks like. And obviously, when the public notice is released, we will, send that out to the membership and do a briefing.
Okay, we had one more question come in, and then we will conclude. Are either of you
yeah, so the comment is just the comment is just reinforcing the need to define the A and Z location for latency, and I think that I absolutely agree that some sort of guidance about how they're going to define that for not for the challenge process itself, but for the certification side is important. That's one of the reasons why we deploy so many remote servers in the field, because we want to make sure that that all of the performance tests that are run are as accurate to what the local user is going to experience as possible. And just to wrap up from my standpoint, I would just like to say, first of all, thank you again to RWA, and we welcome everyone to join us at the RWA Networking Lounge at Mobile World Congress Americas. Mosaic will be there as well, and we're happy to talk about any of the questions that you may have going forward, either then or certainly in the interim. And I know there were several questions about iOS, and I'm happy to walk through what some of our options are on the iOS front as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chip and Aaron. That does conclude the conference call for today. Please visit ruralwireless.org webinar page later this week for access to the recording and the slides. We thank you for your participation and ask that you please disconnect your line. Thank you.